Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools for the life science companies. We help companies with everything from virtual advisory boards, working groups, medical education. We've helped with things like changing protocols for clinical trials, doing Salesforce training, and a whole series of other kinds of corporate meetings. But more importantly, we believe at Impetus that everything starts with a conversation. And from some of these big, hairy, audacious conversations that over time, with added momentum and building serendipity, with some of the provocateurs and the leaders and the people who are on the leading edge of what's new, we can all work to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. And so I'm really excited to have one of these awesome pharma leaders at the virtual table with us today. So I'd like to introduce to you Farah Husein, who I have known for a few years now. She's actually a Canadian lead for the UCAN Value and Evidence Generation Center of Excellence Hub, or the COE Hub. And she's the Director of Evidence Generation, Medical and Scientific Affairs at Takeda, Canada. So really an interesting role, and we're going to want to dig into what exactly this is, since all we ever hear about these days is real world evidence and real world data. She has many years experience working in evidence generation and medical affairs at Takeda, and has worked for a whole myriad of other companies, including Astellas and Bayer and many other companies. So welcome, Farah. So happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
So let's actually go ahead.
I was going to say, if I was thinking when you were talking that if Webster had a word for our industry, it would be RWE.
That's true. Awesome. So we just want to kind of get started. I mean, we're kind of at the tailwind of this crazy COVID-19 pandemic year. How have you been doing, and how is your family?
Well, thank you for asking. I am fortunate enough to have kids that live away from the home, but that makes it a little challenging, especially now that Toronto is locking back down, because now we're different households. So, you know, that has its own challenges. Thank God Thanksgiving's over with, but, you know, Christmas will be interesting.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting world that we live in. Yeah. So you've had a very interesting journey in your world, and getting through all kinds of different professional associations and areas in your career. We'd love to actually have you take us through what brought you into this area of working in value and evidence generation within Takeda.
Right. So, you know, I started my journey as a pharmacist, a hospital pharmacist. I did my residency training and then worked in clinical practice for many years. And as part of that, I went into the whole clinical trial area back at working in the oncology clinic. And that led me into industry, starting out in clinical trials. And then it sort of evolved. I moved over to the medical affairs side of the business, worked as an MSL, medical education, number of different roles, as you had pointed out, medical advisor at Bayer, medical lead at Astellas. And in those roles, supported access for submissions and that type of thing. And so really got interested in trying to really understand health economic data and that basis for decision making. So I went back to school, got a master's in health economics and outcomes research, and then took on those roles. I ended my stay at Astellas as the HEOR lead for Astellas Canada, and then moved over to my current role at Takeda from there. So that's how that evolved.
Love it. Good for you, and great inspiration for us to go back and learn new things. And it's, you know, there's always opportunities to gain more expertise in the pharma space. There's always more to learn. So we hear these initials all the time, HEOR. We've heard, you know, health, outcomes, health economics, outcomes research. But what is it exactly? So to the layperson, how would you explain and kind of culminate in a nice little package everything that you learned when you got your degree to explain to somebody what HEOR is?
So actually, that's a really great question. So how I explained it to people is, it is everything that you would need to make that decision that a treatment is of value to you. It brings you benefit, but is still within your ability to access it. So if you took that to your personal situation, and again, I always go back to, it really feels like when I started out as a pharmacist, where you're trying to help advise patients on the best therapy for them, and you had to work with them to make sure that they could access it. This is HEOR is the basis of how you do that on a societal level. It really provides that data for decision making by HTA bodies or payers, and it allows you to understand the value that a medicine or a therapy brings to a patient and to the healthcare system.
So tell us a little bit about value. That term has a lot of legs to it. It could also potentially have a lot of definitions. And as we live in a world now where there's myriad fractals of what truth is, as we've seen in a whole series of other things, around science and what's truth and what's not, we can equally apply the myriad of definitions of what value is on a medication. So as it relates to your version of value, how can value be ascertained for a new product, medication, service, what have you?
Wow, this could go off in a lot of different directions. So as you pointed out, that value really is in the eyes of the stakeholder, right? So if I'm a patient, my first understanding of value is, does it prolong my life? Does it improve my quality of life? Does it improve my functioning? Does it, relieve my symptoms? Those are the things that are probably the most important aspects of value to me. And then I have to weigh that with, can I afford it? If in my personal budget space. In Canada, luckily, most of our medications are covered in through the public health system, and some kind of obviously working age persons private coverage as well, and that's a whole other issue. If you're talking about again, health systems and the HTA bodies like CADIF or INES, and the decisions that they make and how those translate to the provincial payers, their understanding of value is informed by sometimes hard parameters, things like quality adjusted life years and the cost of those relative to the cost of an item. But it also is informed by patient values, whether those same things I just spoke about, those outcomes that are important to patients, whether those are being achieved, and also if you are able to achieve efficiencies or advantages to the health system. So it's kind of a big package of things that define value. It's not one thing that defines value.
So it sounds like it's an ecosystem of a myriad of parts. And it really brings one to consider this idea that this is a systems thinking. It really requires a holistic approach where there's various players, so each of them acting like a Lego block in this overall picture. So if we were to dissect these different entities in this overall systems ecosystem of value creation and understanding, let's actually take a look at each one. So as we look at the patient journey, what's the first group of people where value would be determined? So, I know we talked a little bit about the patient, but what other components or entities or institutions or agencies are, have an interest in the value concept outside of the patient?
So, in one sense, the way our system works in Canada, the patient is almost the end user, because for the most part, patients in Canada are fortunate enough to not have to pay out of pocket for their therapies, there's often another, either a public payer or potentially a private payer that would help, with that cost. So the stakeholders quite often are, for especially when a new therapy comes to the market, obviously one of the, and this is assuming it goes through the regulatory agency, Health Canada, and is approved, the next bodies that are involved in evaluating that concept of value tend to be the HTA bodies, and for the most part that's CADIF, and there's obviously subgroups of that for oncology and so on, and there's the separate body INES for Quebec, and they're heavily involved in looking at the clinical benefits of a product, the cost-effective analysis, that economic data or the budget impact when it comes down to the payer level. And as I said, they look at the impact on the patient as well as on a health system. And then they take those components, and then the HTA body would make a recommendation for reimbursement. And it would either be, fund the product, not fund the product, or sometimes it's yes, we recommend reimbursement with certain criteria or restrictions or that type of thing, and those are then adopted or not adopted by the provincial payers, because their lens is then, how do we bring it into our system and make that sustainable based on all the other things that we're paying for, other innovations and so on. And it's not just a drug budget at that point, because even though a drug budget is one component of a provincial health budget, it's certainly not the only component. And there are many other things, and not to oversimplify things, but you have to pay for MRIs, COVID testing, all these things in addition to drug therapies. So in fact, there's actually a number of stakeholders all the way down before a patient actually gets access to a medication.
So it's a very, very complicated process. So let's actually just do this almost like a case study. If we were a new pharma company, let's just say located in Germany, and they want to come in and market a product in Canada. So what would be the very first step that they would have to follow in terms of, and actually they've just received a regulatory approval through Health Canada. So what is the very first thing that they need to do in order to get this product in front of a patient? So let's just look at step one.
Right. Jokingly, I would say they would have to hire some consultants, some very good friends of mine that could help them, achieve that effectively. And the reality is you do actually have to have some knowledge of how the Canadian healthcare system works, because there are companies that don't have a presence in Canada that do assume, oh, you're like the US, or oh, you're like Europe. And in fact, we're actually like 10 different countries, really, when it comes down to it. So there, I can't underestimate the expertise that people in when I say our access teams, I mean all across the industry, access professionals have, they're like the Swiss knives of our toolkit, because they have such knowledge to be able to work in that specialized environment. So one of the first things you would have to do is to navigate the submission. You'd have to decide whether it is something that needs to potentially receive public reimbursement. And if that is the case, then there is a CADIF submission process that is followed. You can submit to that about 6 months prior to your expected approval, or you could do it post-approval. Many companies do that as well. And that decision is made on the basis on which we spoke. And then shortly after that decision by an HTA is made regarding reimbursement of the product, then the provincial reimbursement starts, that process starts province by province. And, there's varying timelines, there's various considerations. there's timings of these things, because if you don't get it in by a certain time, maybe your decision doesn't come by another certain time. So it's actually it is a bit like dominoes. And then that process happens. It's a variable time frame on when it is, but let's say I think the earliest this company could expect potential public reimbursement in some of the larger provinces in Canada, that may be up to 2 years after you brought that into the market. So that's, I think, also a bit of a surprise for some companies, especially when, for example, we do have many similarities with the UK. NICE is the body that makes is the health technology assessment body that makes the decisions on reimbursement for the UK, and their decisions are implementable by the National Health Service, the NHS, that pays for drugs and services and so on. But it's not an automatic process here, because the provinces, because they have the ability to fit something into their budget or not, and when that happens, it's not an automatic adoption of the recommendation from the HTA body. So there are subtle differences between the countries. So that's sometimes a bit of a shock for countries, for companies that come without a presence in Canada and not knowing the environment.
So let's actually tease out or linger a little bit on the CADIF process. And so based on the fact, what's interesting about this is it's a centralized process, and every drug that comes in or tries to get public access at a provincial level has to go through this HTA review. In your experience, where have what works really well with that centralized model? And where have you ascertained as some of the gaps or challenges, and which makes this such a long, tedious process?
So I hope you will have another chat that will investigate that properly with an access-based professional. I come at it from a medical perspective in support of access initiatives. I think the process is actually quite efficient, really. It doesn't, when you're looking at, the data is data. Data doesn't change because you're a different stakeholder looking at it. It's what you do with that data as the stakeholder that is different, but the data itself is not. So the evidence package for CADIF is quite well laid out, and in fact they have beautiful reference cases. They have wonderful guidance documents that outline what needs to go into your submission in order to look at comparative clinical benefit relative to other things that are in the market, at the way to present that economic information in a similar fashion, and so it is an efficient process to be able to do it in that manner, versus having every single province having to separately do that analysis and perhaps come to a different conclusion when it comes to the outcomes of that assessment.
And so once it actually goes through that process with CADIF, what are you finding some of the similarities or dissimilarities with INES, specifically in the province of Quebec?
I think they're more aligned than not. And I think perhaps one of the key differences with INES is it officially takes a more societal perspective than CADIF. CADIF takes a public payer perspective. And in INES, because they make recommendations to the provincial health system directly, it's a holistic approach, because it's not just a siloed drug budget that's being impacted. It is the overall Ministry of Health budget for all health services and products. And so their decision-making reflects that.
Absolutely. And when the results or decision of let's approve this versus not, and now we're going to disseminate this to the individual provinces or agencies to make their decision, how does the evidence play out in each of those provinces' decision of public approval and moving forward? Are they using the same criteria? Is it now suddenly into, the thing that we tried to avoid in the initial place, which was separate approval bodies in every province? Is there just basically no way to get away from that? What does that look like as we emerge out with a positive decision from CADIF?
I think there's probably room for greater alignment and timing, but I think maybe it's just so many years of observing it. It seems like it's working for the most part. I think there's been definite efforts in areas like oncology to have little discrepancy between how the provinces have adopted the recommendations and implemented those. And so that's probably the area that's probably the most closely aligned. There is as many people here would know, and there's probably ones that are much more expert in this area than I, but there is a subgroup of CADIF, PCODER, which does the assessment and decision making for oncology products. And that goes through a deliberative committee framework assessment. And so it does lend itself to much larger considerations and the ability to have that recommendation adopted by the provinces, I think, much more easily than some of the non-oncology assessments.
So as your role at Takeda for being the director of generating evidence, tell us a little bit about what evidence means, looks like, and where does it apply in this whole process of CADIF and of economics review. So tell us a little bit about how you generate evidence.
So now we're in areas where you're going to have to shut me up. So this is so real world evidence. We have actually been doing it for many years, and the only thing that's changing is the reasons why we've been doing them and the increased focus on what you can do with real world evidence. So to break it down, most people have been familiar for quite some time with some of the data that is real world evidence. It answers questions like, what is the number of eligible patients to be treated with a therapy, right? What is the epidemiology of the disease state and how many people we could expect? Those types of things were always done, especially in the pre-marketing stage for everything from forecasting all the way to inputs into economic models. Same with understanding that patient journey, the treatment pathway, how people come into the system, to how they're diagnosed, right through treatments, what are the different types of treatments, the current standard of care, and understanding, for example, resource utilization associated with those current standards of care. So all of those, again, are things that were done for many reasons. They were done sometimes through market research. They're sometimes done through, observational, non-interventional trials, and they have had various usages both internally for company manufacturer purposes, or they are external, again, most likely as inputs into economic models. What's evolving a little bit is when in the past, I think there was much more of you brought your product to market, you had your economic data and your clinical data, there was a decision that was made about reimbursement, and then, that was adopted by the provinces or not. And then you moved on because there wasn't the need for a reassessment or a reevaluation of your drug therapy. So what's changed now is with increasing innovation, with ever tighter budgets, etc. Now there's more of a need to answer the question after you market a product to say, is the drug actually being used the way we thought it was going to be used? Is it actually bringing the benefit to patients the way we said it would? And when there are continued new entrants into the market, what is really the right options for a patient, have things changed? And so I think that's where it's become more important to do real world evidence to answer those questions. So things like drug utilization from claims data, from internal, patient support program data, from any number of different sources. Certainly new ways to do outcomes data. And we spoke at the very beginning of this chat about outcomes that are important to patients. Well, those ones are really hard to find unless you're getting them directly from a patient. And that could be challenging in a post-launch setting. But obviously with the onset of many sort of digital strategies, there are ways to collect those patient-reported outcomes that are of interest directly from a patient. But even that aside, obviously there are some hard clinical outcomes that are available in the real world, survival being one of those. And there are others. There are other surrogate endpoints that are available within certain data sets. And so those are the types of changes that we're seeing with real world evidence. So it's when we would do it, because in the past, I think it was focused mostly on the pre-launch setting, and now it's peri and post-launch as well. And the purpose for what you were using it, right, has changed.
So let's actually just linger on that for a minute. I'm going to talk about it from the standpoint of pre-COVID, and then we're going to talk about how COVID has accelerated or decelerated certain methodologies and thinking. So pre-COVID, so you've actually said real world evidence has been in discussion for years and years, probably at least 20 or 25 years. But now when it's being used, it's like you said, it's now peri and post approval. How, in some ways, why has it evolved to peri and post? I know you were mentioning some things about economics, new competitors, entrants, limited budgets overall, and continual evaluations. Tell us a little bit around what is actually happening with things and the impact that pricing and the impact on risk sharing has on the decision to continue the need for accumulating, assessing, and packaging this evidence over time.
So I can't really speak to the pricing aspect. That's really sort of outside of my scope and expertise. So I would be making it up on the fly if I answered that part of the question.
Just looking at it as a factor in why it's evolved to continuing evidence generation during and post approval.
Yeah, and a lot of that is really because if you want to continue to improve patient outcomes, you still have to ensure that you're maintaining the sustainability of your health system, right? So there is that tension, and some of it has become more challenging. I'll deal with the COVID part of the question in a second, but some of that has been some of the innovations that have come to the market in the last couple of years have changed have really been a paradigm shift. And I hate using that buzzword, but they really have been, because two of the increasing trends is the pace of innovation has changed. For example, I think I saw a statistic last week at the ISPOR Europe conference, where almost 50% of oncology drugs come to market in different markets, not necessarily Canada, with phase 2 evidence, because that you want to bring the drug to an effective therapy to market as quickly as possible, and it comes to market with not phase 3 evidence. So right away, you're not getting the, controlled long-term comparative data, etc. And so that's been a challenge, because again, the traditional methods of assessment are based on phase 3 data, or things like the cell and gene therapies. There have been a number of those where the entire approach to determining value is thrown out the window with those, because our system for assessing value is really based on chronic treatments that sort of amortize the benefits over the lifetime of a patient. And really what you're asking for in a cell and gene therapy, which if for the most part they are a single dose administration and the benefit is over lifetime, but it's this tremendous upfront investment, right, in resources, we don't have a way of accounting for that currently. So there's been all of these changes bring a lot of uncertainty into the decision-making process, because the decision-making process doesn't account for these differences. And so every time you have uncertainties, you do need to address that with additional something. So that's where you've seen the introduction of risk sharing agreements. And that's about all I'm going to say, because in terms of pricing, because I think that's one of those ways of risk sharing from a decision maker's perspective. And that's also the need for additional evidence, because every time you introduce an uncertainty, the only thing that continues to address that is more evidence. And if you don't have that evidence pre-launch, then you kind of have to gather that evidence post-launch.
So what does this mean for pharma at a macro level? So now we're in an environment where there's a requirement for continued evidence that your product is working the way you said it was going to work. Or we're giving you access, or we're giving you reimbursement for certain ways, and we're finding that patients aren't using it this way or using it this way. How much at a risk are companies in this continued need for assessments longitudinally to potentially losing their product on public access, or having it removed or no longer paid for? Is this something that puts pharma companies at risk longer term? And is there any case studies where that has actually happened? Like, what is kind of the mindset around this need for real world evidence over time and these continual assessments on economics?
So I think I would approach that answer as this is a worldwide trend. It's not a Canadian only thing. And in some ways, the European markets have been doing some of this for quite some time. You've seen coverage with evidence agreements, pay for performance, all kinds of these things that have been implemented in different markets. And the reality is all it from an industry perspective, I would hope that we all see those types of initiatives as helping to build in that sustainability into the health system. I think we all have a part in maintaining that sustainability. We all live in the countries in which, healthcare is funded, and so, personally as well as part of an industry, that is one of our I think our social responsibilities. So I think that yes, there is a greater expectation that we will do our part to provide that data for decision making. I think there's room to evolve over who is responsible for generating that data, because sometimes that's within the ability and the purview of the company. Sometimes it's external to that. I mean, as you're probably well aware of some of the oncology initiatives across the country, where those are that data, that real world data, is generated by people independent of pharma, groups like Can Revalue. There's a number of other initiatives that have been led by others, where they're generating real world evidence on products, and that data is brought into decision making by HTA bodies and provinces. And I think there's going to be more and more of that, because I think all the stakeholders in the environment, including clinicians, patient groups, others, have a role to be able to contribute to more data for good decision making.
Yeah,
and
so this is fantastic. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes thinking about post-COVID now. And in some ways it's deterred a few things, in many ways it's accelerated things. We know that during COVID, when it all sort of started in March 2020, a lot of clinical trials just stopped abruptly in their tracks. And that included real world evidence studies and all sorts of other things. And then people started to acclimatize and modify and started incorporating a lot of digital things. So can we speak for a few minutes on the evolution of real world evidence studies and the capture of this important data, leveraging digital technologies?
Yeah. So obviously, luckily, non-interventional trials were maybe impacted differently versus clinical interventional trials. So your traditional, phase 2, phase 3 type studies, those ones I have been impacted, and we're certainly aware that I'm certainly aware that some of those trials have been slowed down because, of course, the first priority for healthcare professionals is patient care in this environment. So maybe they're more focused on that than their research efforts, as it should be. And so, but for non-interventional trials, and in particular, the ones that are done using databases, surprisingly less impact than you would think, right? Because a lot of the time we're already working with database information that is already captured or feeds into the system regardless, because it's reflecting just what people are actually doing, and people are still taking their medications and chugging along in the health system. So those types of studies where their database extracts for the most part have been less impacted. Obviously some of the administrative aspects around it might be impacted, but that part itself has not been. But even for those trials, everything's gone digital. The consenting has gone digital. The ability to collect, we talked about a little bit about those collecting patient-reported outcomes. Well, maybe now that's completely moved to digital, directly from patients. There's, I'm sure there's many viewers that that are familiar with all the various sort of telehealth type things, and those are all means of collecting that data directly from a patient. We all know about wearables, Fitbits and different types of devices that collect patient outcomes and feed that back. So I think there's definitely been, if it wasn't set up like that in the beginning, it's certainly set up like that now, because that's the most practical way to collect that data. One of the things that COVID has really highlighted, I think, is the challenge in Canada is that health data resides in systems that are not necessarily well linked. And so I think that problem has become quite apparent. And so many of us who have worked in the area for years now have always been aware of those problems, but in and of ourselves have not been able to overcome them. We've all devised interim strategies in the ways to sort of stitch all these different parts of the health system data together so that we can extract the full picture. But now the spotlight is on that problem at a much higher level. And so that's one of those things that I'm really hopeful will be solved in the next, within the next year, because we're all aware, every day you hear the data on COVID, and every day they need more data on COVID. Where is it occurring? How is it occurring? Where is the transmission? What is the testing rate? All of these things. And you can't do that unless you have fast access to accurate quality data. That will benefit everyone.
And so this is such an important piece, obviously a huge component of the whole, our real world evidence data, these data lakes. I mean, we're all looking for interoperability, like you said, electronic health records, all sorts of other systems working together to be able to fill in these data lakes. So I want to talk a little bit about data lakes in a minute, but tell us a little bit about these individual sources. And is there changing regulations and legislation around using these sources, and legitimizing them, like patient registries, like patient support programs? These were all sort of hands off. They don't really play out. We can't really use that. How has COVID or other discussions changed that discussion around these other sources of data?
So I don't know if COVID has yet changed that. So I think the governance around how some of those data sources can be accessed, who can access them, and how they can be used, there's a lot of variability across Canada, and it depends what you're trying to access and who you are, and how as I said, the governance is different. I think again, many of us have worked out mechanisms by which we are able to access different sources and link them together. Usually that requires collaboration with an external partner to industry. So there are a number of groups that are well versed in how to do that. Or, you always have the academic type of collaborations, etc. But I think at the heart of your question is, does the governance exist to access any data set in any manner whatsoever? No, we're far way away from that.
So talking about data lakes and the eventuality of consolidating things either at local, provincial, national, and maybe one day international, there comes down this question of interoperability and seamlessness to access this. So data becomes the new oil. We need to refine it to be able to do proper population health management, et cetera. And ultimately, it always comes down to the issue of data privacy, who owns what, can this be shared, all these sorts of things. How does this play out, Farah, in your opinion, based on the economics evaluation? How do we get that conversation started? How do we make sure that the average citizen or the digital citizen understands their rights versus what's shareable, what shouldn't be, so that we can really move the agenda forward in being able to capture and use this data effectively?
So I may approach it the answer from a slightly different angle. So I think key is understand who needs what information and why, right? Because if and this may be my personal opinion, but if the decision maker is looking for data, there's a responsibility on both sides to be able to find that data. And sometimes that data is in the decision maker's purview. So for example, there's provincial data sets that are quite rich in data that if accessed, can give you some of the outcomes of interest. So I think that if the thought has gone in beforehand to say, yes, that data would be able to be used to answer some of the questions we spoke about before. Is the drug being used the way we think it's going to? Is it actually benefiting patients the way we hoped it would? Some of those consents to collect that information and aggregate and anonymize the data so that it can be used, you have to build that in beforehand, right? Because if you haven't, it's quite difficult to go back and do that, sort of apply that back to a data set. And so I think that for the most part, that is happening. I think there are a number of stakeholders that have understood that, how did you say it? That the data is oil or gold or whatever. It's a resource. It is a resource. And I think that understanding is there, certainly amongst many of the partners, including the provincial groups, that is true. And that now, I think, versus a couple of years ago, certainly the willingness to look at the data, the raw data, to be able to extract that useful, evidence, that I think is much more present than perhaps a couple of years ago. But that's just an evolution, because I think people were not fully cognizant of the potential for real world data. Because, many of us that have come up through evidence-based medicine over the years, believe in the RCT, right? And that will never change. That is the gold standard for establishing evidence, you know. And but the reality is there's a lot that you can't answer using RCT data, and so the rest of that resides in the messy real world.
And it's really interesting. It is kind of pushing the envelope, if you will, on standardized belief systems. And it's probably one of the reasons why some of the infrastructure that we built under all of these approval processes and reimbursement and regulations are built on old systems. And it takes time to change the mindset and the belief systems associated with what is evidence, what does it look like, and what are the variations? Because we always believe that it was white and black, but there is areas of gray, as you mentioned, which is this real world, messy life gets lifey stuff. And so I guess,
I think part of the challenge for industry has been, you know, and this was recognized quite some time ago, but traditionally, most companies brought their product to market based on a regulator need, right? And a regulator needs to understand the efficacy and the safety, and that's the primary basis of decision making. That's very different than a health HTA, a health technology assessment body, or a payer. What they want to know is, how is this new product going to bring value relative to everything else that's already being used for that particular thing? So that's a very different question than is it effective or efficacious or safe.
Absolutely. There's so many other things to consider. And as we look at all these data lakes, we do have to look at the refinery piece of this. This is actually all of those artificial intelligence algorithms, the machines, the smart machines that are taking this stuff and parsing it and packaging it into understandable little nuggets. Unfortunately, the data is only as good, the algorithms and the analytics are only as good as the data that's inputted. And then it comes down to this question of, is some of these algorithms intrinsically biased based on the kinds of patients and the information that has already been input? So I guess the question comes down to is, based on the new future that there may be this world of patient-reported outcomes and using the sensors and the wearables and all these other things, the people who are the haves versus the have-nots, who have all the technology, who have the broadband, are we creating, is the digital, like, is there some truth to this digital divide? And is there some truth to perhaps these biased algorithms that are only going to be dissecting the data from the, you know, kind of the chosen ones who have the technology?
Okay, so I'm going to put on a bit of a geek hat here and sort of separate your comments. So first of all, I think if what you're saying is, if we are moving to collecting more of our data digitally, that does actually depend on people having access to technology, right? So they need smartphones, they need a computer, they need a Fitbit or whatever device it is that you're giving them to capture the data. So that is an equity issue, because of course that not everyone in even our developed country of Canada has access to those things. So is there a selection bias in the information that you now gathering? Potentially, because now you're stratifying a little bit on socioeconomic basis. So I think that's potentially one way to answer your question. The second thing, though, is when you mentioned AI, you know, we have already started, and many companies have started to work with companies that are involved in natural language processing. So they scrub, you know, reams and reams of electronic medical chart data and sort it into something that can be digested. That's the sort of my very low tech explanation as to what they do. But in that, you have to train it, as you were just saying, right? And that's where my understanding is the more training you provide, the better the algorithm is at finding what you need them to find. And that takes a very long time. It takes a lot of expert input, clinician input, other, sort of data people's input. And my understanding is the outputs are actually excellent. So, it's kind of the same garbage in, garbage out, but also quality in, quality out. And so therefore, I would think that from the few projects that I happen to observe, that part is actually done quite well, depending on how you train your algorithm. But yeah, there's certainly, if your comment was you can do that step badly, absolutely. It is something to keep in mind when AI is applied. It's not a perfect panacea. And then the other part of your comment was with respect to that digital divide.
Yeah, for sure. And so if you were to give advice to pharma as we sort of project forward into the new world, now there's been a lot of focus on healthcare. It's really kind of heartening a little bit to see on local news stations and national news stations this focus on pharma and the explanation of mechanisms of action and efficacy rates. And suddenly it's the new layperson's lingo. It's really kind of interesting to see this happening. Pharma is now taking a front runner position. And so there's a lot of opportunity for suddenly, reaching the limelight and being able, like you said, to get focused on some of the inefficiencies and the infrastructure and the regulations to be able to sort of shine the light on things and maybe accelerate things in a forward direction. If you were to have advice for anybody within that ecosystem of what you would like to see changed to be able to move medications, to be able to move the agenda forward on the health economic reviews, analyses, to be able to expand access to patients, what sort of recommendations would you give?
So transparency is, I think, key. I think one of the things that you're talking about is, I think that the increased public interest on how is the trial run, how do you arrive at the point where you have results to share? What is the meaning of those results? What's the time frame between when I see a result and when I see a product into the market, including a vaccine? All of that, I think, is not going to go away. I think that will have a permanent change or impact on the industry. I think the transparency behind that process will continue on the industry side, and the interest of the public in that process. Whereas before in the past, who cared about the trial results other than perhaps the investors, because really, other than something comes to market, no one really sort of thought about what happened before that. So I think maybe there's some changes there.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think that's definitely it. And the communication part, I think, again, people have been thinking, and this is not necessarily on COVID, because I think some of the economics go out the window on a pandemic. But I think with the additional need for more types of data by all stakeholders, because again, in the past, who was interested in the economic data other than the bodies like CADIF or INS and the provincial payers? Nobody. And so now I think increasingly, even clinicians and patient groups are looking at economic data as part of the package of understanding the value of a treatment. So I think.
How do you think health economics outcomes research as a science or as a field is going to change in the world of the COVID-19 vaccine? Is there any lessons that you think will be learned? Is there anything that you think will apply to the evidence generation in that future of that kind of field? What do you sort of see anything or predict anything happening in the future from all of this discussion right now on the vaccines?
I think that maybe not immediately, but over time, it will help that evolution of, we need novel approaches, we need new HTA tools for things that are different, that are not the same chronic therapies with benefit over a lifetime. the COVID vaccine. It would not be one of those things. We spoke earlier about the examples of things like cell and gene therapies, or those types of products for rare diseases, etc. All of those are different, and we do require new approaches, new tools. Hopefully, COVID will continue that evolution or push that evolution.
That's fantastic. This is awesome. So we're at the top of the hour. I could literally talk to you for hours about this subject because there's a lot of legs to it. There's a lot of movement and there's a lot of hope and change. So for those of you who are listening, we will be leaving Farah's information. If anybody wants to connect or speak to her further about any of her ideas, please feel free to do that. We also invite you to check out impetusdigital.com. If you enjoyed this conversation, these are the kinds of conversations you can have in your own private branded portal with other interesting stakeholders, talking about beyond the pill conversations, things like this. How are we going to move the needle on HEOR, changing the way we do things, the way we think about things, introducing digital therapeutics, diagnostics, anything else that might be going on in the brand as you're looking at partnering and growing your strategy and tactics. You can do this asynchronously and synchronously through the Impetus Insight platform. Please check us out if you want, like or subscribe to this video to our YouTube channel or to our podcast so other people can find us as well. Thank you so much for your time and spending the time with us. Farah, this was outstanding. Really appreciate it and wish everybody a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you. Bye-bye.